Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, but where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Belton Bridge Park, Lula, Hall County, Georgia. February 14th, 2010, about 8:40 p.m. A quick Valentine card exchange by the river is supposed to take minutes. Instead, gunfire ends it. The place is small, the lighting sparse, and routine foot traffic is low for a Sunday night. The victim is Richard Shoke, 45, found near his pickup at the edge of the lot. Within minutes, a quiet bend of water turns into a mapped crime scene. First units arrive fast. They lock the park entrance, set cones along the approach road, and mark the nearest tire impressions to preserve sequencing. The command post is simple: a cruiser's trunk light, scene tape, and a whiteboard that fills with timestamps. The responding deputy notes the vehicle's orientation, not nose into the river as a visitor might choose, but slightly off-axis to the painted line, useful later when we diagram sightlines. The temperature is cool, breath visible. Radios are clear, no chaos, just procedure. Medical personnel do what they can in seconds, then the scene goes still. Evidence techs step in. Casings receive flags. Their cluster is tight and close to the driver's side arc. A beam paces the gravel for disturbances and fresh footfalls. The tailgate area is photographed, doors checked for position, and interior lights documented. Technicians log each image with absolute time. This chapter is about facts that hold: position, angles, order of tasks. There is no talk of motive, no projection forward, only what the ground will give us. Negative evidence matters, especially early. Richard's wallet is present. His phone isn't pried from his hand, nor are there signs of a frantic chase. No drag pattern, no elongated skid trace exiting the lot, no debris scatter suggesting a crash. The glove box isn't rifled. The cab doesn't read like a fight. There is no immediate signature of robbery. That doesn't prove intent, but it narrows the field. The park is remote. Whoever fired knew the lighting, the angles, and the likelihood of being alone long enough to act and leave. Scene integrity becomes the priority. An officer logs the perimeter time to the minute. A second lists all personnel who cross tape with purpose, location, and entry/exit stamps. The pickup's key position is photographed before touching. A grid goes down around the casing flags. Trajectory strings are placed to form a rough cone toward where the shooter likely stood. This is not drama. It is geometry. The cone points to a place on the gravel where no one should step until latent and trace work is done. If a footprint exists, it cannot be crushed under helpful boots. You will hear 911 in public reporting about how quickly help was called. Tonight, that phrase remains a clock note, not a narrative crutch. The call started the response. The response preserves the truth. Patrol locks the road. Detectives start the canvass. The canvass is 2 rings. First, anyone who saw a vehicle enter or leave within a narrow window. Second, residents who might have outdoor cameras aimed toward the road. Nothing is said about what those cameras show here. That belongs to later chapters. What matters now is the list: addresses, contact names, exact time each door is knocked. Richard is identified on scene by documents and later, formally, through procedure. We keep this clinical, out of respect, and to maintain evidentiary clarity. His name returns here because the audience needs a fixed anchor. The case is about a man who honored a plan to meet briefly on Valentine's night and did not go home. In towns like Lula, murders aren't just crimes. They pull at the fabric of a routine people depend on. That line doesn't change the evidence. It explains why the clock matters. A supervisor instructs techs to collect air temperature and wind readings. In open lots, they can influence sound travel and help validate or challenge witness estimates of how many shots they heard. A second tech swabs the door handle and the steering column, labeling each swab with time and quadrant. Fence posts and the low rail by the waterline get a quick visual for transfer. A handheld light rakes across small stones, searching for ejected metal that might have bounced beyond the obvious cluster. From the outset, the working posture is targeted ambush. That is not a conclusion. It is a hypothesis that fits the quiet anomalies. Short exposure time, close-in firing, no theft signature, no extended struggle, and a vehicle left largely undisturbed. Hypotheses are allowed in professional work as long as they are tested against the next layers: morgue findings, scene geometry, and the digital clock that the network keeps for us. If the hypothesis fails, it gets replaced. If it survives, it gets refined. Before the scene is released, a deputy notes the exact minute traffic is reopened to one lane for outbound residents, then shut again when technicians recover a fragment in the gravel cone. That fragment goes into a separate envelope, cross-referenced to the casing grid. The chain of custody starts here and will not break. Accuracy now prevents arguments later. We will not preview interviews, payments, or digital chains in this opening. Those are separate forensic angles, each with their own scrutiny and risks of error. What we lock here is the clock, the map, and the absence of robbery indicators. The rest will rise or fall against this foundation. The scene in Lula had been secured, but for investigators, the real work continued in a different setting. Once Richard Shoke's body was transported, the focus shifted to the morgue, where every observation had to be logged, preserved, and connected back to what was found at Belton Bridge Park. In homicide investigations, the body is not only evidence, it is the central document. What technicians and pathologists observe here either strengthens or challenges the assumptions made at the scene. Richard's body arrived with the chain of custody intact. Tags were checked against the log from the park. Clothing, jewelry, and personal items were sealed in separate evidence bags, cross-referenced with the crime scene number. Nothing could be misplaced. Every handling officer signed off, because one broken link could later give a defense attorney room to argue contamination. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation lab made certain the intake aligned with protocol. The goal was accuracy, not speed. The external examination provided the first level of clarity. Wounds were consistent with firearm discharge at close range. Preliminary notes confirmed multiple entry points clustered on one side, matching the tight casing pattern documented at the truck. There were no indicators of prolonged struggle, no defensive wounds on his arms, no abrasions suggesting hand-to-hand combat. The findings supported what officers already suspected. Richard was taken by surprise. This was not a fight in progress, it was a rapid ambush. From there, the autopsy focused on projectile recovery. Each round removed was placed in a labeled envelope, numbered and sealed, ready for ballistics comparison. Trajectory mapping inside the body confirmed what strings at the scene suggested. The shooter had fired from a fixed, close position. Blood panels were drawn for toxicology, not because drug use was suspected, but because complete documentation requires ruling out impairments that could confuse interpretation of cause of death. Every negative result later adds strength to the narrative of an intentional killing rather than an accident. The coroner signed off on the cause, multiple gunshot wounds, the manner, homicide. That distinction, cause versus manner, is what separates technical description from legal classification. Cause is a medical fact, manner places it in the context of crime. Once both are certified, detectives have the authority to move forward with charging theory. In the background, investigators kept asking a simple but important question. Why here? Why tonight? The body confirmed timing, the trajectory confirmed proximity, but motive was still an open column in the case file. At this stage, it was not about speculation. It was about locking down facts so that when interviews began and digital records came under review, there would be a stable baseline. No witness could later contradict what the body already said. From a human perspective, this step carries a weight that is rarely acknowledged publicly. Families want answers, communities want reassurance, but professionals in the morgue keep their focus clinical. To deviate, even in the name of comfort, risks integrity. Still, when findings show an ambush with no defensive injuries, it is hard not to reflect on how suddenly life was taken. It is this precision that gives the justice process legitimacy. Without it, cases fracture. By the time the body was released to the funeral home, the investigation had a forensic spine. Autopsy confirmed the ambush theory and provided physical evidence for the ballistics team. The next phase would be to check if the environment, the truck, the gravel, the surrounding park, told the same story. That cross-check is critical because inconsistencies can reveal either overlooked evidence or intentional staging. When investigators returned focus to Belton Bridge Park after the autopsy results, the priority was to match what the morgue confirmed with what the ground still held. The parking lot, the truck, and the surrounding gravel strip were all treated as silent witnesses. Richard Shoke's body had already been removed, but the environment remained preserved by tape, photographs, and entry logs. To understand an ambush, investigators needed to connect wound trajectories to fixed points in the environment. The truck was central. Its position, angled slightly off the painted line, was photographed from every quadrant. Technicians measured distance between casing markers and the driver's side door. Trajectory rods, first placed at the scene, were checked again with the benefit of autopsy reports. The cluster of shots matched a firing point close to the driver's side arc. No extended spray pattern suggested movement. Instead, it indicated a shooter standing in one position, firing quickly and leaving. That stillness told investigators that whoever pulled the trigger had both confidence and planning. Inside the cab, details mattered. The ignition key remained in place. Gear shift position was documented. Seat adjustment was noted against Richard's height to confirm he was seated in his normal driving posture. No scattered items suggested panic or rummaging. Technicians swabbed the steering wheel, door handles, and center console for trace. Each swab was bagged, sealed, and logged. Negative findings, no evidence of forced entry, no tool marks on locks, supported what the body already suggested. This wasn't a robbery or carjacking gone wrong. The surrounding gravel was combed with alternate light sources and screens. A single projectile fragment recovered earlier was photographed in relation to the casing grid. Investigators sifted for footwear impressions. Some partial prints appeared near the trajectory cone. Plaster casts were made, though impressions were faint due to the uneven surface. Even partials, however, can exclude suspects later. The process was slow, deliberate, and driven by protocol rather than assumption. Attention also turned outward. Neighboring properties were contacted about exterior cameras, though many rural systems in 2010 were motion-triggered and of low resolution. Officers canvassed along the approach roads, noting distances and travel times. The goal wasn't to draw conclusions on who was responsible, but to lock every physical and digital source that might intersect with the precise time window already established. Vehicle forensics went deeper than just the cab. The exterior was checked for gunshot residue transfer. Door panels were inspected for projectile path. Luminol tests were conducted for possible transfer stains, with findings logged regardless of whether visible results appeared. Nothing in this phase pointed to a struggle outside the truck, reinforcing the autopsy's finding of a sudden and targeted assault. One subtle but important observation was environmental silence. The absence of scattered shell casings across a wide arc meant the shooter likely used a semi-automatic and controlled the ejection pattern. That kind of precision doesn't identify a suspect on its own, but it narrows questions. Was the shooter familiar with firearms? Did they select the location for its low chance of interruption? These were open questions, but ones investigators would carry forward into interviews and digital mapping. In communities like Lula, these details carry a weight far beyond the evidence room. A murder in a small town disrupts daily patterns. Parents think differently about letting children go to the park. Couples reconsider routines. The forensic work here wasn't just about solving one killing, it was about restoring trust in the idea that routine places are safe. By the time evidence technicians finished their work at Belton Bridge Park, the environmental record aligned with the morgue. An ambush, sudden and close range, had taken Richard Shoke's life. No robbery signature, no prolonged fight, no random accident, just seconds of precision violence. Next came the clock that never lies, carrier logs, and money movement. Analysts pulled call detail records for the people closest to Richard Shoke and for numbers that interacted with his phone in the 48 hours around Valentine's night. In 2010, this work was straightforward and disciplined. Timestamps, dialed numbers, call durations, and the cell sites each device touched as conversations began and ended. No GPS, no app trails, just the network's own diary. The record showed Richard's routine pattern most weeknights, a small cluster of early evening calls, then quiet until bedtime. On February 14, 2010, that pattern held, right up until he left for Belton Bridge Park. Within minutes of his departure, there was a short burst of activity across two other devices tied to his orbit. None of those calls came from Richard. They were calls between third parties, and they landed inside the same window that the scene team had already locked with photographs and casing markers. The timing alone didn't identify anyone, but it gave investigators a narrow corridor. Who knew he would be at the park and who talked just before and just after? Cell site sectors offered range but not precision. Towers along the route from Snellville to Lula handed devices off as phones moved through coverage, and analysts charted those handoffs to the minute. A device that mattered most stayed dark during a stretch when it would normally ping. That dark interval, no calls, no texts, wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it stood out against weeks of baseline data. When phones that usually chatter go silent exactly when a plan would need quiet, investigators take notice. To anchor the electronic clock to the physical world, the team checked any fixed cameras at gas stations or intersections along the approach. Most rural systems in 2010 were grainy and time-stamped without synchronization, so the footage served only as a time anchor, not identification. A few clips bracketed traffic volume, low as expected. One camera captured the silhouette of a pickup consistent with Richard's route, time-aligned to the carrier window. Nothing in those frames showed faces or plates. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to corroborate movement windows the network already suggested. Parallel to the call analysis, a financial clerk reviewed recent transactions. Valentine's weekend is obvious cover for small gifts or meals. Investigators looked for cash withdrawals that were inconsistent with a family's typical spend. A withdrawal just before the holiday, noted at a branch near a workplace, drew attention. Standing alone, a withdrawal proves nothing. Patterned against calls and the short exposure at the park, it becomes context. If a murder for hire is being explored, timing and denomination matter. Those details stay redacted publicly until they are charged, but internally they form a working theory map that gets tested line by line. The most useful product of this phase wasn't a single smoking gun call. It was the shape of communications, a triangular conversation pattern that spiked before the window at the park, and again shortly after the scene went quiet. Each spike corresponded to known or likely locations based on cell sites, an office corridor in the metro area, a residential sector, and a highway-adjacent sector on the way north. None of this told investigators what was said. It told them when people coordinated, who they reached, and how that coordination lined up with the moment Richard stepped out of his truck. A single analyst's note captured the caution used throughout. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean patterns can be coincidental. They can also be crafted by people who believe silence will cover them. That's why every number was subpoenaed again for subscriber identity, every prepaid account checked for purchase location, and every voicemail ping logged for attempts to retrieve messages later that night. From a human standpoint, this stage feels technical, but it carries weight. Families want answers, communities want certainty. The only fair way to reach either is to let math and minutes trim away stories that don't fit. It isn't dramatic, it's careful, and it respects the difference between a crime solved and a complaint settled. By the end of this pass, investigators had a working contact lattice and a money timing overlay. The next step wasn't to accuse, it was to ask, measured interviews that hold statements up against the network's clock. If a story said, "I was home, phone on the counter," the CDRs would show whether the device truly slept or if a call slipped through when it shouldn't. Detectives scheduled structured interviews with the spouse, close coworkers, and 2 associates who appeared in the contact lattice built from call detail records. Each session started the same way: a clean advisement, an audio timestamp, and a narrow scope. Only what the person did on February 14, 2010, before and after about 8:40 p.m. at Belton Bridge Park in Lula, Georgia. No theories were offered. The goal was to capture statements that could be tested against the network's timing and the scene work already logged. The spouse described the plan as a simple Valentine's card handoff, just a few minutes, and said the location was chosen for privacy. Claimed arrival time was given within a 5-minute range. Claimed departure was right away. When asked who suggested the park, the answer shifted. First, we both did. Then, he wanted to meet there. Then, it was easiest. That kind of drift is not a verdict, it's a marker. Investigators noted each phrasing and moved on. Coworkers were asked for normal patterns, how often the couple met at night, where they usually exchanged items, whether the park had ever been used before. One coworker recalled hearing about a quick exchange earlier that day. Another said the spouse mentioned a late errand near the county line. Those memories aren't evidence until they sync with independent logs, but they help target subpoenas and follow-ups. With statements on tape, analysts overlaid the answers against the CDR plus cell site window. A tight spike of calls between 2 third-party numbers occurred within minutes of Richard leaving home, then silence during the critical stretch at the park, then a second spike shortly after the scene went quiet. None of that activity originated from Richard's phone. When the spouse was asked to account for phone access during that period, the answer was that the device was put away and not on me the whole time. The tower record showed brief activity inconsistent with that claim, not a confession, just a measurable inconsistency that would need explaining under oath. Investigators also measured duration claims. Just a few minutes can be tested. From the last verified call Richard made to the first call placed by the spouse after the event, there was a gap that exceeded the stated round-trip time by a margin that couldn't be explained by traffic or a wrong turn. The interview transcript captured a follow-up. Did the spouse leave the park immediately after realizing something was wrong? The answer was yes. The contact lattice suggested an intervening pause before calls to anyone outside the small circle of third-party numbers. Again, not a verdict, just a time mismatch. Two associates who appeared in the CDR triad were interviewed about their own whereabouts that night. One said they were home and didn't touch the phone. Their carrier log showed an outgoing call during the dark interval that characterized the park window. When presented with that single timestamp, the answer shifted to, "I might have checked voicemail." It's routine for people to misremember exact minutes. That's why every question stayed anchored. Show the minute, ask for the action, record the correction. The other associate attributed activity to weekend plans, but could not identify with whom, then declined further detail without counsel. The file reflects this neutrally: assertion, correction, refusal. So any later motion practice has a clean record. Financial questions were folded in carefully. The spouse described routine Valentine spending and said there were no unusual cash withdrawals. Bank statements showed a withdrawal just before the holiday at a branch near a workplace corridor tied to one number in the CDR triad. When asked if any cash changed hands that weekend, the answer was no. The clerk's notes and transaction logs don't prove intent, but they set up a targeted subpoena for surveillance at the teller window and a precise time check on the branch DVR. Whether that video ultimately exists or is usable in 2010-era quality is a separate issue. What matters here is that the statement and the ledger can be compared objectively. Throughout these interviews, demeanor was documented but not weighed as evidence. Calm isn't guilt. Agitation isn't proof. The only judgment applied was whether each claim could survive the timeline built from autopsy, scene geometry, and carrier records. A simple example. If someone said they learned of the gunfire from a call made right away, the CDR either captured that outbound call within minutes or it didn't. Where the CDR contradicts, prosecutors later decide whether that contradiction is probative or collateral. One internal margin note captured the caution that kept this process fair. Patterns create suspicion, not conclusions. That is why every interview was logged with exact start and end times. Why every device in the triad was resubpoenaed for subscriber identity and activation history, and why any prepaid account tied to those numbers was checked for point of sale. It's also why the word crime doesn't appear in reports until cause and manner are certified and a charging theory can stand on its own. By the close of this phase, the file held a series of testable inconsistencies: who suggested the park, how long the meeting actually took, whether a device truly sat idle, and why a pre-holiday cash withdrawal overlapped the communication spikes. None of those points alone names an offender. Together, they justify the next move: linking payments, locations, and contacts through receipts and surveillance. Financial records and purchase logs became the next layer. Investigators traced cash withdrawals leading up to February 14, 2010. One withdrawal stood out, larger than normal, made just days before the park meeting. Teller notes and branch DVR confirmed the timing, though cash alone did not explain intent. Retail subpoenas pointed to prepaid phone cards and simple equipment like flashlights or gloves. Some store DVRs had already overwritten footage, but one still captured a figure purchasing a prepaid kit. Network logs showed the device was activated briefly, then went silent, a profile consistent with one-time coordination. Gym access data also contradicted claimed routines. A member said they were present, yet entry logs showed no swipe. When layered with cell site records, the absence suggested time was spent elsewhere. Individually, none of these anomalies proved a plot. Together, they outlined preparation: money secured, tools acquired, normal habits dropped. That was enough for investigators to justify broader search warrants. With financial ledgers and phone records aligned, investigators had the framework for formal charges. Warrants were issued for bank accounts, prepaid phones, and vehicle searches, showing how money and calls lined up with the time of the ambush. A Hall County grand jury returned indictments against Stacy Shoke, Lenitra Ross, and Reginald Coleman. The The charging theory describes Stacy as organizer, Ross as intermediary, and Coleman as the triggerman. Prosecutors built the case on overlapping timestamps, bank withdrawals, prepaid purchases, and call detail records, each confirmed through custodians of records and chain of custody protocols. Ross went to trial first and was convicted of malice murder, her conviction later upheld on appeal. Coleman accepted a plea to malice murder and received life without parole. Finally, Stacy Shoke pleaded guilty in late 2012 and was sentenced to life without parole, the district attorney stating she was the driving force behind the crime. The interagency work remained local and state level. There was no federal or international reach. What mattered was admissibility. Records stood intact under challenge, and the timeline was preserved in court exactly as investigators had built it. Paperwork finally met the rules of proof. Pre-trial hearings opened with suppression challenges aimed at the spine of the timeline, call detail records, and cell site data. Prosecutors laid a clean foundation through carrier custodians, how records are created in the ordinary course of business, how timestamps are generated, and how tower sectors are mapped for historical queries. The judge admitted the records. Bank video and teller ledger entries were likewise authenticated as business records, with chain of custody testimony showing who retrieved them, how they were copied, and where they were stored. Defense counsel pressed on gaps, overwritten retail footage, angles too poor for facial ID, but the state stipulated to the limits up front, avoiding overreach. Bail was not the focus. Public safety and flight risk factors were eclipsed by the seriousness of the offense and the tightness of the time map. At trial, the state presented its sequence without dramatics. The jury saw the timeline in minutes rather than broad strokes, a withdrawal that did not fit routine, a prepaid instrument acquired and briefly activated, contact spikes near the Hall County Park around the time of the ambush, and the absence of ordinary calls during the very window when life events usually create noise. Experts explained what cell records can and cannot do. They place devices in contact with towers, not GPS dots on a screen. And the court instructed the jury to treat those inferences with care. That honesty mattered. When a prosecutor admits the limits of a tool, the jury tends to trust what the tool actually shows. Witnesses set context. A teller confirmed cash movement glimpsed on bank DVR. A store asset protection manager described receipt systems and retention settings that explain why some video survived and some did not. A lead analyst from the sheriff's office bridged the physical and digital tire tread associations, cartridge case markings, and the way a quiet, unforced entry at an open park tells investigators to look outward rather than inward for a shooter's point of approach. The medical examiner supplied cause of death in direct, technical language, leaving motive to the lawyers. Lenitra Ross's prosecution came first. The jury heard the communications chain connecting her to both the organizer and the shooter, then weighed the money trail that moved through her. Defense attacked intent, arguing poor judgment, not malice, but the combination of records and messages convinced jurors this was coordination, not coincidence. Verdict: guilty of malice murder. The court imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole. An appeal later tested the admission of cell phone evidence and the effectiveness of counsel. The conviction and sentence were affirmed, which validated the courtroom method that had built the time map. The shooter, Reginald Mr. Results Coleman, resolved his charges by plea. The state would have presented the same records plus additional firearm comparisons. The defense minimized risk by accepting malice murder and a sentence of life without parole. With that plea, the triggerman's role moved from allegation to judgment, and the timeline no longer depended on disputed admissions. The final step was the organizer. Stacy Shoke entered a guilty plea to malice murder. In open court, the district attorney described her as the engine that set the plan in motion, noting how the financial moves, the communications, and the arranged meeting at Belton Bridge Park converged. The judge imposed life without parole. Whatever narratives had been floated before, marital strain, alleged fear of custody disputes, claims of mere robbery planning, none changed the record-based sequence that brought a husband to a dark river park with Valentine's cards in his pocket and never let him come home. Legally, this ending is straightforward but weighty. Murder for hire is not solved by a single clue. It is proven by the consilience of ordinary records agreeing with each other. Bank clocks, receipt printers, tower logs, and limited video, each modest on its own, became powerful when stacked in order. The defense had room to argue about coverage gaps, about meaning versus correlation, but the court's evidentiary rulings kept the focus fixed, what the record showed, and only what the record showed. Jurors heard experts who stayed inside their lanes, not storytellers. That is how difficult trials earn durable results. For communities, a verdict does more than penalize. It draws a boundary line around truth. In towns where neighbors still look each other in the eye, a crime like this tests the fabric. Trust inside a marriage, faith in institutions, the belief that patterns of life mean safety. The lesson is not theatrical, it is practical. If you plan violence with disposable tools and quick cash, you are still planning in the footprint of systems that record, timestamp, and preserve. Those systems are not perfect. They are sufficient. And when investigators respect the limits of each tool, juries do not feel misled. They feel anchored. Family impact statements close the courtroom air. They did not revisit the scene. They named the loss. A brother speaking about a dependable man who showed up, fixed things, and expected little credit. A colleague recalling reliability over years, not months. Judges hear many of these. They do not all sound the same. Here, the words were plain. A life cut cleanly out of a routine and a name engraved on a park's memory. No two murder files resolve alike, but this one ended without spare threads. Intermediary convicted, shooter sentenced, organizer sentenced. Appeals tested the most technical pieces, phone records, and left them standing. The chain of custody remained intact. And the timeline, built in minutes, held its shape under final judgment. Guilty, sentenced to life without parole. Thank you for staying through a full, fact-based account. If content like this helps you understand how investigators turn small records into large answers, share what detail struck you most. Was it the minute-level phone activity, the bank DVR, or the careful limits placed on expert testimony? In towns like this, clarity after a violent crime is not vengeance. It's a public service, earned one timestamp at a time. As the file reached court, the focus shifted to admissibility. Prosecutors moved to admit cell site data, surveillance video, and procurement receipts. Defense counsel challenged reliability, but judges upheld the evidence. Bail was denied given the seriousness of the crime and flight risk. By spring 2021, Linda Stoltzfus's remains were recovered near Route 41, confirming the movement model investigators had already built. That evidence, added to the record, left little room for defense strategy. Facing a strong case, Justo Smoker agreed to plead guilty to third-degree murder and kidnapping. In July 2021, the court imposed a sentence of 35.5 to 71 years in state prison. The ruling reflected the harm done to a vulnerable victim, the concealment acts, and the community's lasting impact. The plea spared a jury trial, but preserved accountability through documented, admissible evidence. Guilty, sentenced to 35.571 years. Telling Linda's story reminds me that justice is never automatic. It takes persistence, evidence, and the courage of a community to stand firm against wrongdoing. As someone who has walked you through this crime, I want to leave you with this. Life is fragile, and safety should never be taken for granted. What lessons do you take from this tragedy? Do you believe stronger community awareness can prevent crimes like this in the future? If this video spoke to you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from or what stood out most to you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.